Thank you for joining us today on this final day of the 20th Annual Celebrate Invention at the University of Michigan. I'm Mike Sarathakis, Director of the University of Michigan Tech Transfer Venture Center and Managing Director of the Accelerate Blue Fund. This afternoon's Celebrate Invention session is the basics of creating an early stage academic startup presented by Manny Stockman and Anurag Argwal of Osage University Partners. Before we begin, I'd like to run through some housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded, and as a registered participant, you'll be receiving a link to a video recording after the fact. If you've submitted questions during the registration process, thank you. And if you have any questions that you would like to pose to our panelists during this session, please make use of the Q&A feature, and questions will be monitored by our staff and asked as time allows. Manny and Anurag are principals at the investment team at Osage University Partners, a venture fund focused on investing in university-based research startups from approximately 100 universities that have partnered with them since 2008. OUP has made 6 investments in the University of Michigan startups across life sciences and tech sectors. They are fantastic partners to our office in the U of M startup ecosystem, and they are always happy to engage and support the research teams and resulting startups that spin out of U of M. This very informative presentation on venture capital is just one of the ways that Osage brings value to the relationship they have with U of M, as well as other universities across the country and in fact around the world. And with that, I'd like to welcome Manny and Anurag, and take it away, guys.
Welcome. Sure, thanks, Mike. Hope everyone can hear me. Anurag, let me know if I'm not coming through. Sounds good. Let me share my screen and we'll start the presentation. First off, thanks for hosting us. It's a great partnership we have with the University of Michigan, dating back several years. And as Mike said, we've invested in several UM companies, Ambic, let's see if I can name them, Ambic, Everactive, Census, Cura, Tangent, and Melendo. So it's been a really prolific relationship. Michigan is one of our best partners, and the office you all have at the Tech Transfer Center is just top notch, in the way that they bring both licensing and venture experience to the team. It's a pretty special setup you all have. So today we wanted to take the time just to run through our view of what's important in starting a company out of a university. And we've shaped a few things into this talk, and we really appreciate the chance to give it to you all. This is the first time I've worn a button-up shirt, I think, in 6 months. I thought I was going to be dressed up, but Mike, you outdid me with your jacket. As I said, I'm Manny Stockman. I won't go into my background. I'm a principal on the investment team, background in aerospace engineering and applied physics. And I will speak for Anurag, who's a principal also on the life science team. And that's typically how we split up the fund. There's a life science team and a tech team. We work closely together, and our life science team is full of really deep experts across primarily therapeutics, but also development of devices and diagnostics. So this is what we'll run through today. And I wanted to start, though, in something that's not on here, which is a brief history of university startups. I think one of the questions that came in early was why start a company out of a university? And I think there's a number of really interesting reasons that I didn't really appreciate when I was finishing up grad school. And now I think there are a number of reasons that coming out of a university as a professor or a grad student or a postdoc, you really should be considering it. For one, a lot of the most impressive companies today have spun out of universities. There's a number of the companies here below. Google obviously was a spin out that's been very well known, but there's a few really important ones like Databricks, which is changing the database infrastructure stack, Akamai, which kind of runs how we do the internet today, along with some very forward-looking companies like Control Labs, which is in the AR/VR space, and Facebook acquired, and others. So, it's a way for, I think of university startups as a way for you to stretch yourself into a career path that's not what you would encounter in your normal university role. And it's a way for you to really test your idea of, what we hear from a lot of professors is, well, if they've run a 15, 20 person lab, running a company should be easy. And it's not. There's so many other things that you have to take for granted when you're in a university that are different when you start a company. The other part is one of the reasons that I left my previous job at Lockheed was this, world of technology transition is different. I think as a researcher, as a scientist, a lot of what you do at universities is about seeding technology for the world. And I think 50 years ago, that was the way. Universities were developing technologies and industry would license those technologies in directly from the university. But in the past 10 or 15 years, that transition is just difficult. Technology takes a lot more expertise than it used to. It's very multidisciplinary, and it's been more difficult for corporations to develop it. And so there's this gap, and I think startups are filling that gap. It lets you take your research and transition it into the real world, and that's just a very exciting process. And there's a couple other things that I think are really important. These startups end up becoming great recruiting engines for your lab. The number of companies that we've invested in who have, let's say, 50% of their employees stemming from the professor's lab itself or the progeny of that professor, since their technology is so relevant, ends up happening a lot. And personal wealth. I mean, the difficult aspect of being a professor is there are other compensation engines for you outside of academia that are attractive. A startup is a way for you to drive that personal wealth while still maintaining your role as a university employee. And there's lots of conflicts of interest to figure out, but many companies have created an immense amount of wealth for researchers. So the history of university startups. This is a quick, eye chart on every startup that we've tracked over the years that is above a certain threshold of dollars raised and valuation. Some of these companies have exited, some of them are still active, but it's just an interesting plot. I have a blog post on this that you all can find somewhere. But this is, we have a ton of information on startups that have spun out of universities across life science and technology. And there are several unicorn billion-dollar companies on here. And you can see a couple things that I think are interesting. For one, life science is dominant in the kind of dollars that they've had to raise, but also in the value that they've created. So there's been some amazing activity in the therapeutic sector for life science that's generated value in the real world, both for outcomes and financial. And then on the tech side, they need to raise less money. It's still a lot of money, tens of hundreds of millions, but there's a significant amount of exits that end up being very discriminating. So companies that are highly valued, even though they haven't necessarily raised as much as a life science company. And just to put up some numbers, we thought it'd be good to drive into our data and really show you all why Michigan's a great place for startups. So the university has raised $5 billion over across 235 companies or so that we've tracked since 2008. And we track a lot of universities companies. And there's a couple things I know are really special about Michigan. For one, you all have been able to drive some success stories into the semiconductor industry that for the longest time were very hard to do. There was a semiconductor winter that has hit a renaissance recently, but during the winter, Michigan was creating great companies, and consistently now too, they are. And so the tech phys sci world of Michigan has raised actually a higher average dollar per company than other universities would expect in the same domain. And then life science, there's also a healthy distribution of companies out of the University of Michigan. So it's a very strong balance of startups that have raised a lot of venture capital across both sectors, which is what we pay attention to and what we look for and where we spend our time. So let's just move from that little prelude on why you should do a university startup and what's interesting about that world into I imagine many of you on the call are thinking about a new venture. And I think the concept of a new venture is hard. You can't as professors hold yourself back from seeing all the other startups out there and thinking of whether you could have done it or not. But the reality is most of these other startups that are not spinning out of universities are business innovation driven, keen insights from industry. And a lot of what comes out of universities ends up being what I think of as technology push. There's a discovery and someone is very excited about it and they want to form a company around it. And that's the start. And there's so much more that has to come after that. And that's a lot of what we're going to dive into here. So it's a very long path. And I think there's a few things that should be considered before, or realized and appreciated before you start a company after you have your eureka. It's, really that technology does not equal product. So there's a couple nuances to that. A lot of times, I'm surprised how often I hear this. I'll talk to a professor, a researcher, or a grad student who's starting a company, and they can say, I've been doing this research for 10 years. I've received $20 million from DARPA and NSF. I've effectively had my seed funding already. And it's never truly the case. And there's a few reasons why. It's surprising how hard scale up is in general with technology. And it's also typically, not likely that the government funding, use cases that they've been interested in, define product market fit for you. And product market fit is the key reason why a lot of physical sciences companies struggle to move quickly when they spin out universities. In the life science space, I'll let Anurag interrupt me, but it's just the start when you have your technology discovery, when you have a target. There's obviously a lot more risk. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Anurag.
No, I think similarly from a technical side, what the product market fit would be in the life science side, that is the real drug development. Yeah, most of the grant funding are towards identifying a target, but not really to make a drug against it. So it is the foundation for drug development, but the drug development risks are still there, and therefore, equity capital, which is focused on that, has a different risk profile than what the government funding has.
Yeah. So, I often suggest to startups to pause the technology development, focus on what product they would build. If they think that product that they should build is the one that the government funded them to do, I have a very skeptical eye, but it's possible. And so, we just really think that the product market fit is the most important thing you can think about early on. And then just be very thrifty with the capital you have, whether it's small, $50,000, $100,000 kind of startup money from the university, or a very early angel or seed investor. Everyone likes to see that scrappiness. And I think a lot of the trend, yeah.
And Anurag, if you can jump back on, we have a quick question. I think this is a relevant time to ask it. So it is, what is a good time, especially for a life science company, to be formed? Not necessarily to go after venture capital, but from your guys' perspective, when should the company actually be formed outside of the university for this type of work?
Since I think it's a life science question, Anurag, do you want to take that one?
So
you're muted,
I think there are a couple of kind of thought processes behind it. One is sometimes operationally it is just needed. Like I think SBIR or STTR require you to have an entity which is a startup, and therefore that can force you to make a startup, even though you may be performing most of the work in the laboratory still. So I think that is a good reason, and I think if that is not the reason to get some non-dilutive funding, I think one should always wait till they can raise some equity capital. Let it be from angel investors, let it be from venture capitalists or strategics. But if you're not bringing equity capital, there may not be benefit in spinning that out yet.
Great, thank you.
All right, let me share my screen again. So, I think this kind of feeds into some of what Mike's discussing. So I think you need really three things and I hope everyone can see my screen. I think there's three key things when you start a company that you need to have in place. And it's first and foremost in reverse order of how we think of things. It's, you need a management team. And you don't necessarily need that CEO person, that one that's a great fundraiser, that has an incredible network, that understands the business domain, but you need someone on your team to represent that capability. And that sometimes is the academic. Very rarely is the academic the long-term person for that role, but the ability to step away from the technology and understand the selling dynamics of the industry they're going after is a key feature that we think of in terms of management. So it's good to have that mindset set up. And specifically out of a university, it's hard to start a company or hear from a company for us when the professor and the professor maybe wants to do 20%, the grad student actually is kind of thinking of having, instead of the startup, maybe he goes to join Google. So you really need to have that full-time commitment from at least one or two people. The other side is you need to understand whether there's a real true product need and really become a student of the field. Look at all the other technologies or in life science compounds that have failed. Really have your ducks in a row and understanding the world, because some venture investors have been around the game for 10, 20 years. They've lived through multiple cycles. They've seen every form of clean tech or every material, every chip, and they really want to understand why you'll be different given what they know. And on the science side, I think it's table stakes for a university startup. And so I think every professor we speak with, every grad student we speak with, we don't really ever think we're going to give them a trump card on saying, hey, your approach to quantum computing, gotcha. This is, I know it's not going to succeed. We don't have that capability. What we often do, though, is we have a good understanding or a good network to say whether something is scalable. And so have a good mindset as to whether your science is scalable, if it's a materials technology or a photonics approach, or even in the software world. Sometimes you actually do have things that are too much of a burden, too much of a computational load that it doesn't make sense to scale. So
maybe
yeah,
one thing to add here, I think one point that you hit very clearly on was alternative approaches. And that is one place where we see a lot of young startups not being completely honest and covering everything that is out there. And those can be seen in two ways. One is, kind of presenting it on a slide and comparing and contrasting to your approach. And second is actually taking it to a very very stringent test in a biological experiment for life science, so that you can actually show your superiority or comparability than just a qualitative analysis on the slide. And, either at some point the startup has to do it. And if it is, if the startup has already done it, I think it does add a lot of credibility for the VCs that the startup is looking to really ask the hardest questions up front, than, kind of make a case for themselves without knowing the lay of the land.
So another quick question, I think it's well timed for this. How much focus and resources should be allocated toward the development of IP, at this early stage when you're thinking about possibly doing a startup?
Yeah, on the tech side, it's important to have IP. I think a lot of the universities we work with, the startups that come out of there are built on a core IP discovery. But we really think that I really think that before you lock down IP in the tech, phys science domain, it's important to have your product defined and your market picked out, because you can waste a lot of resources brainstorming IP in a specific application area that may not be relevant for what you think you should go after. So I think it's good to have a moat, and oftentimes in startups that we invest in and the VCs that we work with, an investment is usually triggered upon completing a license with a university. So IP is important to have, but as you think of it, think of a core kind of moat that you build that's foundational IP that hopefully you can work with the university on setting up. It's a great way to offset the costs of it, and then you license it to your startup as it spins out and around a finance. Most investors will look for that type of IP fence and licensing from a university as a part of a big investment. And then when the company really ramps up, then you start to build more of a war chest. But you have to be really careful about how much you spend on IP. But I think that's obviously very domain specific.
Yeah, again, on the maybe speaking on the life science side, I think IP is very critical. And when, IP also comes in so many different flavors that, one has to differentiate those as well. And VCs definitely do. Is if you have a composition of matter, which kind of means you have a molecular structure that you have patented, those are the most valuable patents. And if you have a novel compound and it's not patented, that's a big red flag. The question then becomes, is this you have not tried, or is it not patentable, and stuff like that. On the other spectrum of the IP, there is a method of use IP of, like, let's say you discover a target with a novel role. Those tend to be less valuable IP because those cannot stand in court. Your composition of matter is what stands in court in the end. So those become less valuable maybe. And then there's everything in the middle is like assay development IPs or know-hows. And I think those can be equally as critical as composition of matter. But I really, like in this case, I think that the leaning on the tech transfer office is really helpful, because if you're not doing it in the startup, tech transfer is really, has a good grasp on what does it cost, what's the value, and what are the probability of getting that IP accepted. So I think, kind of leaning on that office and kind of getting the advice there is the right step.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, I think we're already behind. We only have 60 slides to go through. So, the entrepreneurs that we work with are come from a diverse background set. And I start here because this is the important thing that you all can do at some point in the early days of your company, is track down that entrepreneur that you can work with as an academic. And, the entrepreneur could be you as a professor, or it could be your grad student or your postdoc who wants to start the company with you. It's difficult to imagine a company, that wants to go raise 20, 30 million without having a strong entrepreneur behind them. And so, there's a couple buckets you put these roles into. And the novice entrepreneur is someone that has often appeared as, they often are circling around universities. They're, strong performers. They maybe have shown some, business expertise, but no real track record. And so those are the ones that I think don't necessarily deserve, let's say, a CEO role, but they have a purpose of just, giving the company liftoff value, like energy and liftoff. The serial entrepreneur is the real home run person to bring into your company if you can. And it's, there's one thing that we always look into when we're, doing our quick background check on LinkedIn on a startup or a company is, what successes have the people involved had? So if you're a professor, have you started a company before and sold it? If you're an entrepreneur, have you raised capital before? Have you shown that you can make your investors money? And if you have not made them money, what have you learned? So that just experience of the cycles of startups is really important. The corporate entrepreneur is something that is also interesting for a lot of university startups, both in life science and in tech, because they're starting to come out of their corporate environment, Samsungs, Intels, the Mercks of the world, and get excited about the opportunities that university startups are presenting. So they maybe have had a hard time, like I did, let's say at Lockheed, transitioning technology, and they say, I just want to go start a company. I'm going to go find some great technology. And they bring a lot of industry insight, and that's really valuable. Where they sometimes are missing is on the grit, and whether they have the experience or appreciation of all the other things that maybe some of their admins or junior team used to handle in the corporate environment. So they can bring a lot of customer contacts and insight, but you do want to be careful and make sure that they really are appreciating the full complexity of running a startup. I'll just quickly comment on entrepreneurs we funded. I'll mention the one from Michigan. So this is Professor David Wenslaw from Everactive, with formerly called Sidekick. And the great thing about David, so if you were to think of him as an entrepreneur, he was an amateur, a novice. He was a professor who was starting his company for the first time with a UVA professor who he went to grad school with. And what they did was great. So David and Ben are still active in this company today. They had a level of appreciation of what was going to go on in the company that, they existed since day one. They knew they didn't want to run the books, figure out hiring, handle legal things. And they knew they needed a CEO who would bring them an instant network, both for customers, for a view of the market, and networking for fundraising. And they did. So they brought in a CEO who helped the company all the way through the Series B, and it's just been a great relationship. As you can tell, David's pretty modest. You know, he's a co-CTO, co-founder. He likes to do things collaboratively, and that's been a great way to hire great people on them. And so we really look for that in our entrepreneurs. When you're, looking at entrepreneurs and like what we look for in the academics that we back and the entrepreneurs that are a part of those teams, I think I'll just comment on a few things. So, for judgment, we really look for someone that's has both tactical and strategic viewpoints. A lot of researchers are tactical. They know what tactics they need to execute on to get to the next phase of funding or the next stage of development. They're strategic in their view of the technology field, but in terms of being able to view a business landscape and understand how to prevent forces from large competitors and dynamic selling dynamics, that's something that we really appreciate and we think is really important. So it's that balance that's really great to see in the entrepreneurs. And whether you're a young entrepreneur or a seasoned one, that ability to bring in better people around you, I simply say this, I look for people that they're A quality people who can hire A+ people around them and don't feel threatened from that. So, we really appreciate a level of modesty in our entrepreneurs that typically comes down to, are they hiring great people around them? Can they get them onto the team? And so that's a key thing that's great. Also, it's surprising how often startups, when they talk to investors, have a lack of transparency. Most investors are not here to go start companies of their own and replace the management. We want to invest in teams where we can give them money and they can run with it. So there's no thoughts on our side of talking to a startup or a research group and doing something like that. So we want transparency. And if you don't see that early in the conversation, if you kind of raise hairs on our arm and we have some flags, it kind of just ends the conversation for us. And we'll quickly dismiss a deal just because we can't really view the relationship as a transparent one. And I think I mentioned this before, track record is just so important. And so if you don't have a track record, obviously it doesn't mean that you can't get funding, but you may want to think about bringing people around you who have a strong track record. And that's really, really kind of key for us. I think in the spirit of time, I'll just quickly highlight that, when you have your team built, it's you have to be able to work well together. And the key for us is if you don't have the business acumen, you have to bring someone who appreciates it. And we have to see that you two or three or four trust each other. And actually, it's been interesting in the Zoom world of COVID. We've been really active in getting to know not just the CEO of the company we're investing in or thinking about investing in, but we'll have one-on-one Zoom calls with the rest of the team now, almost like at least 3 or 4 other people separately without the CEO there. And it's been a great way to get a view for how the team collaborates. And I think it's been one of the nice aspects of this virtual world is getting to know a full team and appreciating all that well before the investment. Sometimes when we were in the past doing diligence on deals before COVID, spend lots of time with the CEO, and then in a group setting, on a group call or on the visit to see the company, you'd have a 4 or 5 person membership of the team present for a big meeting, and you don't get that one-on-one capability. And so, I think the entrepreneurial side of this is what most researchers lack, and that's what you have to be really focused on learning or bringing in someone who can bring that to the team. So, this is a graphic I think our marketing person put together, and maybe even was before Game of Thrones came to its conclusion or after the first season. So, think of yourselves as a fleet of people. So obviously Eddard Stark is here, because he's replaceable since he died in the first season. But no, this is, really meant to show that there's a role for everyone, and it's about who you bring around you and that you need multiple people to build this. And, typically professors and grad students end up in this chief science, chief technology officer role. And the CEO role is can be also that academic. We like to think of it as more as an interim CEO role versus casting a message to investors that as a professor or a grad student, you are the long-term CEO. It's just very rare that anyone is a CEO of a company that's a CEO of the company on day one is still that CEO 4 or 5 years later. And so we like to think of that as a modest person would say, I'd replace myself with the right person. So quick highlight, if you're thinking about forming a company on corporate structures, I'll keep this simple. If you want to take in capital from venture, plan on being a C Corp. And there's just many more good reasons to be a C Corp than an LLC. We've never invested in an LLC. I can't imagine we ever will. There's a lot of reasons why, but from a perspective of what you need to do to build a company, things like there being no option grants allowable, it just creates a lot of flags for investors. You can't really take a company public or exit well. So it's a limited upside for significant downside. The main upside of an LLC is tax benefits and not being double taxed. The C Corp just has so many more standard structures that I think you all can really focus on being a C Corp out the gate. I mean, sometimes LLCs are okay to start with out the gate, but then you're spending more money on the conversion later. So let me know if you have any questions on that. I'm sure the Venture Center office has also helped companies figure this out as well. Getting close to the end of my session, I thought I'd also just sort of tee up some views for you on how to go get your capital. So you're a startup, you're early, you're spinning out of the lab, and where do you go? Do you start talking to the big corporate players that funded the research at your research at the university? Do you go to the billion-dollar funds? These are all it depends type answers, but most startups early on will be scrappy, and we look for that. It's important to be scrappy. You don't have much money, so think there's ways to bring in non-dilutive capital from grant agencies, the SBIRs, STTRs of the world. DARPA has been pretty active funding startups or companies, obviously small businesses. As has a couple new things, like the Air Force is a major push called AFWorks to work with startups. Those are all non-dilutive mechanisms. And then you can go work with an angel round that's driven a lot of times by friends and family and your network. And it's a difficult road to hoe, but it's definitely a way that a lot of companies get funding. And then the question is, how do you get on to this top area of venture capital and strategic money? How do you get exposure if you don't have a network there? And there's a couple things that we look for. One is you have to just go figure it out. Use your network as best as you can. Have really reasonable conversations with the investors you're connected with, and try and make connections from the people to the people that are at the funds you want to work with, and drive those conversations that way. Some ways to accelerate those conversations are to join accelerators and incubators, and leverage the network that creates for you, even if it's not exactly in the perfect fit for you. So there's a couple incubators that people really track and watch, like Silicon Catalyst if you're a semiconductor company. Y Combinator is obviously well known. So you want to find one that's a fit for what you're building, but the biggest value you'll get out of any of these things is your network. The other thing is University of Michigan has a great team that exposes startups to all the venture investors out there. A lot of my friends in venture are on Michigan's email list. We're on Michigan's email list. And so, leverage Mike's team to help you get connected to the investors that matter. And then, above this, in this venture capital section, is a cadre of venture investors. And I think in a couple slides, I talk about how to pick the right ones.
So quick question again, since you have this slide up. From Osage perspective, when do you want to start engaging, and not necessarily having them pitch for funding, but what's the right time for a team to reach out to you? And I appreciate the words about the Venture Center, because obviously we work with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're happy to talk, and this is easy to say. I don't mean for it to sound like lip service, but our fund is built on our relationship with universities. And so we enjoy talking to startups at the earliest stages. And it's for a selfish reason, which is we love maintaining our relationship with the university and adding value that way. So our network of deal flow is driven by our name at universities and helping companies not just by investing, but by giving them advice on product market fit. Obviously, all the things that Anurag mentioned before on understanding failures, and then getting connected to the investors that do. So for us, I'd say we talk to certain professors and grad students about their research projects that we think are interesting, but I think it's pretty rare that we would ever turn down a conversation from a professor or a grad student that wanted to talk to us about a potential startup.
Yeah,
so we're happy to do that.
Yeah, I can attest to that too. So thanks.
Yeah. We're also all, our backgrounds, we all came from the research world, so it's something that I think we just love doing. And at a lot of these other funds, you'll find similar people too. And those are the ones you want to track down. So for investors at other funds, if you have a technical, specialty that you think is worth turning into a company, find the PhD investor at one of these other funds that seems to be, a real tech nerd at heart, and reach out to them. If you're evaluating business models, there's definitely venture investors who are more business model based than technology based, and leverage that type of conversation, that idea for a conversation with those investors. So every so often, you'll definitely find other investors that are willing to talk at the earliest stages, and we can recommend a few. So, just to run through the numbers, I mean, when you talk to a VC, don't expect to get an investment. There's a phrase that Lou Berneman, one of our founding partners, likes to say: if you're looking for money, ask for advice. If you're looking for advice, ask for money. And that's, I think, the key thing. There's very few deals that come across our table that we actually do. We're tracking thousands of companies, as are most investors, and our deal rate is probably less than 1%. And so it's about handling the conversation, extracting value from the conversation, despite the past. So you never know, at the end of a conversation, a VC may say, hey, this is not a great deal for me, but I know my friend at this fund has been looking for something like this, and I'll be happy to connect you. So, we always, I often say, this probably took this from a partner, I think I did, when you send out a pass email or have a pass conversation with an entrepreneur, and it just turns out to be a great conversation, you process, you say, they handled it like a pro. And that, in my mind, I think better of that CEO for the future. And for us, as a lot of investors, we'll look at future rounds of a company even when we've passed before. So, trying to look at the questions right now. So there's a few on the good questions on market sizes and projected revenue stages. So this is a great question from the university audience. So there are investors that are pre-revenue seed investors, and there's investors that are post-revenue, scale-up investors. So there's kind of three buckets. There's pre-revenue, there's revenue, and then there's growth capital, growth revenue. So the pre-revenue companies can get venture capital. They can absolutely go get seed capital. And in fact, I think most seed investments are done in pre-revenue companies. If you're software, you may look for pilots. If you're a materials or semi or hardware company, usually you have no revenue, just a prototype. And if you're a life science company, nowadays there's never revenue before you're acquired. So I think the seed capital world is definitely open to pre-revenue startups. In terms of market sizes, I think this is a really interesting question out of universities, university startups, because some companies just don't necessarily need venture capital. And if you do the math, we're looking to invest ourselves 15 to 20 million into a company over a few rounds alongside other investors. That's what we need to do to actually spend our fund. And so when you do all that out, you're raising 30 or 50 million overall for multiple investors, and you need to be a company that's worth 500 million to $1 billion or more. And there's a few sectors that are often coming out of universities that just don't really have a feasible path to that kind of opportunity. And so certain market sizes are just not that relevant. So, I think anything below $1 billion total addressable market is something we just always feel hesitant to touch. And so I'll just leave it at that, and let me know if there's any additional questions. So as I mentioned before, it's kind of a very few percent of our, 1% or so of deals that get through our process. This is a great way just to walk through the how we view deals. We receive a company and company sends us information and we consider it, and, we'll have a meeting with the company. So, 28%, 1 in 3 deals are getting from that, looked at a pitch deck, decided to have a call with a company. Another 1 in 3 of those are the next step of meeting with the partners on our team. So there's a partner, 2 partners on the life science team, 1 partner on the tech team, and that's the kind of next step. As a part of that, we would then, if that went well, around 50% of those go to due diligence, which is when we're exploring the company, talking to everyone we know that has a relationship with the entrepreneurs, talking to industry, and then we would, elevate it another step that's not on here, which is to the full partnership in what's called an investment committee. I think Anurag may talk about some of that later. And if that goes well, then we would offer a term sheet if we're leading the round or, look to be a part of the syndicate that did offer a term sheet. And so those are, very few and far between. And surprisingly, some deals, even after a term sheet, don't close. So just to make sure everyone knows, a term sheet is where I, as an investor, say, here is a term sheet that describes how much I want to invest in your company, at what valuation, and a few other control terms. But it's not a binding piece of paper. And so there's still a lot of work that goes into the process after you offer a term sheet and close the deal. This is just another way of viewing the same information, so I'll skip through it. And, I thought I'd just show you all that, the venture industry is very, very active in funding startups, especially in the last 5 years. So there's no, better time to really be thinking of starting a company in a non-COVID world than it was the past couple of years. In a COVID world, it's still too early to tell what's going to happen to the venture markets. 2020, this is data for venture dollars raised in early stage startups in the US across a number of sectors. And 2020 was off to a banner year. And in some ways, Q2, driven by an immense amount of work in the investing in the life science space, still looked really good. So Q1, Q2 2020 was pretty exceptional. I don't know where Q3 is going to play out. I think we'll see some retraction of investment. But overall, there's a couple takeaways here. The amount of money that's going into startups from venture capital is akin to some very large government agencies. And so for researchers that have been active in tracking down dollars from NSF and DARPA and NIH, this is, a sizable amount of capital that's been put on the table for the startup industry. And the other is there's 2 clear areas that venture is interested in. And the first is wrapped into, I should wrap into one. It's the B2B and information technology space. This is basically software. And it accounts for almost 40% of any of these columns. And the other is healthcare, which is typically, if you were to break that down deeper, it's typically therapeutics and biotech investments, and not healthcare IT, not quite devices, not diagnostics. And so it doesn't mean those startups don't get funded, but I just wanted to at least show you all the growth of venture capital and explain that some of the most active areas that you should be thinking about building companies are in those sectors. So I think I'll just wrap up with this. And when you target investors, I think as I was describing before, there's a few investors who would just love to talk to professors. They're biotech VCs are very active in talking to early stage professors and researchers. Certain tech VCs are very active, but as a potential entrepreneur, potential academic entrepreneur, you should be focusing on reaching out to the investors that match what you're doing. So pay attention to what sectors they invest in, what stages they invest in. I talked to an entrepreneur the other day who said he was getting a bunch of no's from VCs who said they were only doing life science investments. And I don't even know why he had the conversation with them, because it's pretty easy to tell what investors are invested in. So if you don't have access to the data, reach out to us. We're happy to share some of the data from the system that we pay for called PitchBook. Michigan, I'm sure Mike's office has access to similar information. As I said before, be prepared for rejection. It's just a key thing to get used to. And then, every so often we'll talk to startups at the early days that despite, having a team in place, and this, I'm not talking about like Series C, Series D late stage rounds. These are like seed rounds. Sometimes there'll be like an investment group that's, think of it as like a headhunter for VCs. They go try and track down VCs, and they have a contingent kind of strategy in place where if they help you raise a round, they get a fee. And I think I just want to say that's not enjoyable for venture. We like to talk to the companies, not to some middle person who says they have a great set of connections. They may help with tracking down angel funding or very kind of decentralized investors, but for institutional capital like Osage and others, we really like to talk to the team. So it helps you run an efficient process sometimes, but it creates bad first impressions, and we ultimately will talk to the founders anyway, and so it's a little bit of a waste of time. I think I'll just end there and just keep these slides. We're happy to share these slides. These are just a view of a few different funds and where they invest. So this is a life science chart, and following it, there's a tech chart, and the logos just represent that, the certain investors are investing at certain stages. And so there's a few funds like Third Rock and Atlas that are doing company formation. More and more venture funds in the life science space are doing that now. OUP is starting to do it as well. And so target your investor reach outs to the ones that match the stage of your company. The tech world is a little bit hard to wrap your hands around. There's huge strategic investors. There's billion-dollar funds that are writing $100,000 seed checks. And so I think my suggestion here is really just to make sure that you're reaching out to the right person at each fund. And it's okay to do direct reach outs, but sometimes it's better to get an introduction or to someone that knows the fund and can understand what they're really looking for at the moment. So I'll stop there and pass this over to Anurag. I don't know if there's any questions, Mike, that you wanted to bring up, but.
Yeah, there's one out there that's kind of an ecosystem question. I know you guys are familiar with the support we get from the state through MTRAC and what have you. Do you see, that supports universities and entrepreneurship across the state? Do you see similar programs around the country? And, what are your thoughts about those type of funding sources?
I think there's, in my experience, MTRAC has been a great program to work with. They, give the startup a bit of focus and guidance and early stage, non-dilutive capital, which is great. And I think as long as you have a team that can listen and take feedback well, then I've enjoyed those programs. Sometimes they end up feeling a little bit like just continued research projects, mm-hmm. and that's what you just have to be careful of. In other states, we've definitely seen similar things. I know in New Jersey, there's a few opportunities like that. New York has a number of sort of state-sponsored incubators. And so I think there's no negatives in my mind of them.
Thanks.
I think the question that we should always be asking is what the risk that is being taken off the table with that money? And if it is not, then the question, what is it helping with? And if you're comparing one source of capital to the other, I think that because VCs will, give you increased valuation, not because you've raised more money or you've raised money from certain resources, but what risk has been taken off the table.
Great. Well, and I'll throw this out because it's a fun question, and obviously it varies from sector to sector, but one of the questions is, what can a faculty member or a new entrepreneur, what is the key thing, the one line they can say that, will attract investors to at least explore the opportunity? And obviously that's
one line.
What is it that really gets your attention? Is it their experience, the problem they're solving, gigantic market?
Yeah. I think there's a product side of it and a product market side of it, and then the team side of it. So one thing I love hearing, and I've I've told this a number of times on campuses and talks but never directly to an entrepreneur is, you want to hear from that person that they would step aside for the right person. I think I even said that today. And that just shows, just on the tech side, team is so important. And being able to boil down modesty and teamwork into one statement, that's it for me. And that drives me a lot of views about a person as to their ability to recruit great talent around them and willingness to do it. On the product market fit side, we're really in this world now where we need to see big 10x, 15, 20x type improvements on what you're going to solve. And it's actually funny. It's very easy to kind of think of those stories in the materials, hard tech, hardware space. But in software, let's say, where there's a lot of investment activity, like a 10x improvement doesn't make sense. It actually doesn't really, there's no metrics that are often there for software. And so you just have to be, careful, but we do look for big ideas. Building another spectrometer that's going to be just lower cost is not enough. You've got to really think of multiple axes where you beat the performance and unlock value. So that's another thing I'd say is, like, when I talk to companies or professors about what I think they can do, I'm always looking for what they can say or show me that makes me think they can unlock value for the customers that they'll be selling to.
And on the life science side, I think the counter or the opposite question is easier to answer. What can you say to kill a deal? Maybe I would say that when I think an academic or somebody answers, I don't know the answer to that question. Like, sometimes I feel academics feel so pressured that they have to be the scientific leader, that they have to answer every question or they need to know all the answers. And with a wrong answer, your credibility is completely lost. And the fact that you can answer all the questions amazingly, and then on the question that you're not sure of, or you have to kind of extrapolate, saying and accepting that I don't know that, I think builds credibility to the team. And one thing that really makes me feel that somebody is just grounded in facts and will always speak to the fact, and so I can trust them no matter what they're presenting to us.
Great, thanks. I know you have to run, Manny, so I do want to thank you for joining us and participating. Look forward to seeing you in person someday soon. Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. I had to jump off for a last-minute 1 o'clock board meeting. Mike was kind enough to share a question I think I do want to answer for everyone. But I'll let him ask the question later, and I'll just leave with one thing, which is, like, this is a time where it's been hard on a lot of people, but I've never had more meetings. And it's because I'm open to meetings, and I'm happy to meet new researchers, new startups, and just be helpful. And so I think as you all think about something you can take away from COVID and this crazy environment we're in now, is just open yourself up a little bit, and also reach out to people that you think you can learn from across your departments, in the VC community and the startup community. I think you'll find people are much more open to taking meetings than ever before.
That's great.
I'll stay on for a couple minutes and then jump off.
All right, thanks.
All right, I hope everybody can see this as well.
We can.
Great. So I think Manny talked a lot about, how to get to raising the capital from VC or from other places. But one thing that is on everybody's mind is, how do you raise VC capital? And to kind of this, I think my section would kind of focus on how do you pitch, and mostly geared to VCs, but I think broadly applicable to anybody who is giving you equity dollars. And so before before we start, VC is a little bit of a obscure world that not many people, I feel, understand the internal dynamics of. So the first part of the talk, I'll set up how do VC funds work, and then talk about how do you pitch to them. So on the left-hand side of this slide, really, we're talking about how the venture funds are structured. On the top, the fund is really managed, and the decision makers of the fund. So let's say the bosses of Manny and myself are the general partners. And these are the guys who make the investment decisions. These are the people who make the investment committee, which finally says yes or no. Now, as you see, GPs are assisted by folks like Manny and myself, who are the associates, principals, VPs, who kind of do the so-called the dirty work in kind of sourcing the deal first, doing the diligence, and then once it rises above a certain level of interest, bring it to the general partners for a more in-depth and longer discussions. But for VCs to invest, there is another part of the the VC dynamics where do we also have to, like the startups have to raise money from VCs. VCs also have to raise money from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is our limited partners. And they can be insurance companies as listed, endowments, university endowments are big, any pension funds, these kind of invest as one of the asset class, which is venture funds. So LPs give money to venture funds, which are managed by GPs, then we go ahead and invest in startups. And just, fundraising for us, like startups, it sometimes some funds can raise their entire fund in months. Some take a year, some take a couple of years, some can never raise. I think the same challenges that startups face in raising their financing, every 3 to 4 years, a venture fund has to go through a similar process with their LPs. And again, it just depends on what their track record is. If their first fund is always harder than your fifth fund, if you're doing well. And so to some level, I think that's where the GPs understand the challenges of fundraising that entrepreneurs face on a much more frequent basis. So how does this is again the economics of the VC fund. So there are two arms of it. You'll see on the top, it is the management fees, which is basically the money that is required for the fund to be run. So so let's say if I have $100 million fund, then I take about $2 million of it every year to kind of pay for my operation. That pays for my salary, that pays for Manny's salary, and that pays for our boss's salaries, and all the diligence work we do, all the travel that we do. And then the other big part of the mechanics is that, the profit the fund makes. So normally what happens is if I have a $100 million fund, and if it makes $200 million overall, the $100 million in profit is divided, 80% goes to our LPs who gave us that $100 million to begin with. And then the 20 million of it is divided between the GP partners. Now, OUP is a unique fund where our universities are considered as a GP in our fund for the profit sharing. So out of that 20%, universities also get a part of the profit. And that is, for all the value that they bring to our table by showing us these most innovative technologies that, we eventually decide to invest in. So I don't think so that most other funds kind of have this. The GPs are associated with the venture funds. But with OUP, our structure is slightly different. I think this is the last slide on VC structure, but I'll pause after that and take questions. But just a few things that you need to learn about VC fund is that generally the VC life cycle is 10 years. So they use the first 3 to 4 years to invest in companies and would want those companies to mature and return their capital by the end of 10 years. So anything that takes 6 to 7 years is a time horizon they're looking to invest, or 6 to 7 years for return on their investments. The VCs always invest upfront a certain amount, and then they reserve a certain amount to invest in future rounds. So you can almost think of it, every dollar we invest, we can reserve another dollar for future investments. So VCs, VCs generally, as I said, how entrepreneurs have different rounds of funding, VCs have different funds. So, as soon as first 3 to 4 years, our fund is, let's say fund 1 is being deployed. In the 4th year, or in the after 3.5 years, the VC fund may start raising again for their subsequent fund, so that by the time they are done with their first fund, they can immediately start investing out their second fund, so that the in a way investment pace of the fund does not change. That's the ideal scenario, and there is, all kinds of things in between where, some funds are not able to raise the next fund. Some people are able to deploy the fund faster and raise faster, and some have to extend their runway till they raise the next one. So, again, given the current dynamics, everybody initially expected that it'll be tough to raise capital. But in the biotech sector, I think the VC raises have actually really been prolific, and I think it may even top the 2019 numbers, which was already at the top of its game. So some of it has been very interesting dynamic despite the financial uncertainty we are seeing around the equity markets. This is really where maybe more becomes relevant of how to approach VCs, how to pitch them. But before I get there, I'll take a pause and see if there are any questions.
You did a great job of, I think, explaining the structure. Appreciate that. We don't have any questions for the audience, but one thing that I think they might be interested in is, can you talk about the relationship of Fund 1 and Fund 2 and how that dynamic works, especially if they overlap?
Yeah, absolutely. So for any purposes, financial purposes, the funds are completely separate. They're completely separate entities. They can have completely different mechanics of financial mechanics and everything. One thing that is generally so-called taboo or not very often done is, I will, let's say, invest in a company X from my Fund 1. It is unlikely that I'll take money from my Fund 2 and invest in that. There are many more consequences from that. So that is why we reserve capital from the Fund 1 to invest in company X. We don't run, when I start investing out of my Fund 2, it's not that I've deployed all my capital. I have either deployed or reserved it for those companies before I start investing from the Fund 2.
Perfect. You answered my second question. So.
Perfect. All right. So if we keep going, this is, as you think about VC, and Manny, I think, talked about lead VC. What does it mean is, VCs generally invest as a syndicate. And what does that mean is there are 2 or 3 VCs that will come together and fill your complete round. One VC that gives you the term sheet, defines the valuation, defines the control provisions, is called the lead VC. That is where one should focus initially on, the people who can give you a term sheet. And then that lead VC, along with the company, will work together to fill the syndicate, which will be the other VCs who are joining and putting the money at the terms that the lead VC has provided. So that together forms the syndicate. So as we talked about this, I think Manny mentioned a little bit as well, the deals that we look at, people like me, first are the first hurdle to cross. If we are excited enough, we'll bring it to a managing partner, excuse me, which are the general partners of the fund. And then we take a deeper look. And then, so in our fund, like if you're on life science side, I'll take a look. If I like it, I'll take it to Bill Harrington, who's the managing partner on the life science side. We'll look at it together. And if he likes it, then we take it to our investment committee, which is the managing partners from both the tech and the life science side. And those are 3 general partners. So, you engage more and more people at the VC fund as your interest continues to increase. And therefore, if you see, generally one sign that you see that a VC fund has very strong interest is if you see managing partners being engaged early on. They won't be the first pitch that you pitch to. But if after a few conversations, they are getting engaged, you can take it as a sign that there is more traction internally for my company in that fund. So, I think Manny was saying that, give an example of one of the entrepreneurs told them that all the VCs are saying no because they only invest in life science when they were building a tech company. And I think, this slide points to that. It's like, do your homework. And that means at multiple different levels. Do your homework on the fund. What do they invest in? What stage do they invest in? Then if you have a call set up or you're sending it to a certain associate, senior associate, principal on the team, look at their background. For example, I am a PhD in cell biology. I am not looking. I think it is acceptable to understand that I understand what cancer is, how cancer works, and how cancer treatments work. So maybe in a pitch to me, the pitch has to be more on the science side of it, rather than on the financial and the basics of cancer. Versus somebody who may be an angel investor who comes from a real estate business, and you're pitching a cancer treatment, then you have to kind of take a step back and take much more baby steps toward explaining your story. And that just shows that whatever pitch you're doing, you are engaging the other party at the level that is to their curiosity. So, like for example, David Dorsey, he has a lot of security background, and so if you are pitching a software that is on internet security, you can expect certain basic information for him to know. And again, if they don't, they can always ask you. But I think that wouldn't be a wrong assumption. But it would be a wrong assumption if you are pitching to me an internet security company. That has to start right from the beginning. So, and that also tells you that you have done your homework. It makes the conversation much more meaningful and much more meaty for to kind of move forward beyond the initial introduction. I think we covered this. Manny mentioned if you're looking for money, you'll get advice, and if you want advice, you may get money. So in the end, I think this is a relationship business. So it's either money or advice. I think the goal should be how can we establish trust and how can we establish that relationship. If not on this company, we can work together on the next one. So, pitch now, again, maybe Mike, I'll take a pause and see if there are any questions because I'm not tracking them.
No, I think we're good to go at this stage.
Oh, perfect. So I think this is going to be the most critical piece of it where, making the pitch and this deck becomes almost the representative of your company that gets to my desk before you do. So, always as you're sending an email, the pitch has to be attached to it. And that is the first impression I get of the team, of the company, of the technology. So it becomes a cornerstone of what your company is. And I think one of the things that the company should spend one of the detailed time on. So, as I said, it is the initial interaction. And so the pitch has to be concise, clear, and deliver the point that is going to get me to say, let me have a call with them. And that is the key. It's not about filling with more information. It's about making the most critical information stand out in the most prominent way. And again, we see many pitches every day. I review at least 4 to 5 different decks every day. And therefore, to rise above that noise, things have to be very clear. Remember, if we are only investing in 1%, our default is to say no and move on to the next one. And so your goal is to kind of give us the pause from moving on to the next one. And you have to find that hook so that I can say, that sounds interesting. I should be looking at it more. And again, the slide just outlines different things that are, kind of can get VCs interested. But I think in the end, that should be the goal. That is the message clear? If I flip through the deck in 5 minutes, do I get the key points? And that is the question you should be asking. It is not beneficial if your critical point is on the 50th slide on that deck. Most likely, I am not getting there, given the limited amount of time I would have to screen through this. So, let's say you've got the pitch, you've made it clear, got the VC interested, and now it's time to pitch in person or on Zoom or on the phone. The question always for the early stage startups is who pitches? And I think here there can be differences as Manny was pointing out that the academic founder, they can themselves be entrepreneurs in the beginning of the company. They may be the CEO. So, in that case, it's an easy choice. But if you do have the CEO, I think the pitching is a team game because the team should be complementing each other's capabilities. And therefore, if you have an entrepreneur who's a CEO and you're the academic founder, you both can be involved in the pitch. The entrepreneur takes the business side of it, pitches the vision of the company, the structure of the company, and the academic founder can really describe the science and why it is so compelling. So again, the whole idea is whoever is pitching should be playing to their strength. And one of the key words that I'll use again, I think I used in answering one of the questions, is the trust. Your goal should be to get us hooked, and second, trust that whatever you are saying is real. And that trust is very critical because this is a long-term partnership if things work out, and trust is going to be the foundation of it. And therefore it's very difficult to make it, but easy to break. And it starts from the first pitch itself. So again, these are 10 different things that your pitch deck should have. I don't think so these would be very surprising to anyone, but always, it has to be so-called tailored to your technology. All of this does not always make sense. Like, for example, go-to-market strategy from a breast cancer drug, that is very clear. You don't have to kind of describe that. But in that case, you have to maybe define the clinical strategy. How are you going to select the patients? I think key things that you cannot omit, I think, are leadership and board. That again, which centers around what is the team who's doing this, the data, which can be the product profile or your biological data. We are all deep science-driven investors, and therefore we all live and die in data, and we live and die by it. That is another key piece of it. And I think the third is an ask, and which is combined with milestone. What are you asking for, and what is it going to get you, and what does it de-risk? Because the entire thesis of venture world is, what is the minimum amount of capital I can use to de-risk the largest piece of it? And so you have to kind of, if it's not very clear, you have to guide us through that process. So I think if I have to say, those are the absolutely things that are absolutely needed in a pitch. If you are kind of even using it for like 15-minute pitch to the VCs. Again, Mike, I'll take a pause and see if any questions, and if not, I'll keep going.
Now, there's a great question that I think is timely for this. What market sizes and projected revenue levels are you looking for in investments? And would you or Osage ever fund a great product concept in a small market with lower exit multiple potential, but a higher probability of success?
Yeah. Now, I think this is a great question. And I think the answers on the tech side and the life science side are very different. Remember that if we are an early stage investor, our probability of success is pretty low. And therefore, our multiple requirement on that company is very high. So usually what happens is very tiny commercial markets just cannot give us the returns that we need. Now, I do understand the lower probability of success, but remember, if I have a $300 million fund, and if I can invest only $5 million in a company and get 3x, that just means that to get a 3x fund, I have to have all of my investments work out. And second, I have to make 60 different investments. And that is just a lot of investments to find. So sometimes some technologies are just not suitable for large fund VCs because we want to deploy 50, 20, $30 million in a company, and the company just doesn't need that. And look, if somebody like OUP who's not leading, but investing alongside, that means if I'm investing 20, the company is needing 100 to $200 million. And therefore, it just doesn't fit the math. So I think you will find investors who would be much more suitable for that smaller market, higher probability of success. But then also, most of the life science VCs are looking for big opportunities that require significant capital so that they can deploy their fund and get the returns they desire.
So you think, where should companies like that go? Angel markets, those kind of things?
Yeah, no, angels are great. I think a lot of them, like in life science side, I can say that there are a lot of foundations that put money in such things because they are very big unmet needs, but commercial opportunities are limited. Different NIH fundings are being defined for this. NIH is funding some clinical trials even in certain areas. Then I would also say strategics. These are the people who are looking for commercial product, and if with a small investment they will be willing to do that. If you think of like BioMarin, they recently said that they would be out of an ultra rare market, but they were earlier on, they were perfect example. If you have a very small market, but of transformative therapy, BioMarin was the person that they're going to acquire you. So I think you can find, it may not be the traditional VC funding, but the other sources are there.
Okay, and one more follow-up since we're talking about decks.
Absolutely.
How succinct should a presentation be, especially for therapeutics where there's a lot of deep science potentially?
Yeah, so I think in the first deck, which let's say you have 40 to 50 minute pitch time with some Q&A, I would say 20 to 25 slides is good enough. I think you're right, therapeutics always has deep science. You can assume that some basic science is known by the VCs because most likely they are masters or PhDs, and they have looked at the field and so much no basics in there. And then second is, you don't have to show me every in vitro and in vivo data. Show me the most striking in vitro and in vivo. And again, this idea of what is your hook? Where will you see me kind of sit up straight and pay notice? Look at that slide. Is it compared to competitors and I'm blowing them out of water? Or is it the xenograph that shows regression of the tumor, or a rare disease showing the mouse model complete recovery of function? These are the kind of data that you should highlight, and the rest is always, you can throw it in the appendix, or can actually even make a bullet point slide of saying that we have shown in vitro this happens, in vivo this happens, without actually putting the data there.
Great. I think we're good for now.
All right, cool. So I'll keep going, and I know there's only 15 minutes left. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly and leave 5 minutes at the end for questions. So I think Mike had asked, what is one thing that kind of makes me pay notice to a founder? And I have said that the opposite is true. Easier to answer rather. What would kill a pitch for me? And I think here we have given something that kind of suggests to that. And I think the biggest thing is that credibility piece is don't try to hide, don't try to massage your data, don't try to misconstrue, or don't try to oversell it. And that is entirely because, that's where the credibility is built and lost. And if we lose that upfront, there is no path forward, I think. Obviously good presentation guidelines, be concise, be clear, be slow, read the audience, pause for questions, and be engaging. No questions from VCs are also pretty bad. And too many questions can be also disruptive to your presentation. So make sure that you allow for some time for them to engage. And again, if you don't know something, the better answer is I don't know versus trying to answer in a way that may be faulty. So for us, we are kind of doing art, as everybody knows here, that VCs will do due diligence. And so the due diligence in that process, when we are trying to learn more of the company, overturning every stone and seeing what's underneath it, there are two opposing forces that are happening. Entrepreneur is trying to get VC to say yes, and the investor is trying to get what is one piece of information that will tell me that's not a good investment. So they're trying to get to a no. Entrepreneur is trying to get to a yes, and that tension is actually very good because it makes a very collegial, very intellectually stimulating discussion. And honestly, as a researcher at one point, more than after the investment, I love the interaction during the diligence, because then you can, it's just more of an intellectual discussion. And I am an absolute fan of it. It can be a long process, but hopefully it is an enjoyable one. So again, if you look at what things drive success and failure for the companies, and you'll look in the green, both for all the sectors or life science broken out, team is the biggest thing. And then in the life science side, you'll see the next biggest thing at 31% is technology. So for life science, we focus on first two things: is the science differentiated? Can it make a difference? And second, who is behind the science and can they execute? And those two are always a cornerstone of why an investment succeeds, and all you'll see also why it fails. And this is where, again, if you look on the life science piece, the 34% is failure because of team and 36 is because of the technology. And though, again, same things that will make that are the key for your success are also the key for your failures. Again, this is what kind of things we focus on: team, and then let's say science are the two biggest things. So we have harped a lot on the team, but early stage, a lot of times there is not a team, at least on the life science side, and especially for the VCs who are looking at company formation. But for us, there is a team. There's a scientific team that is the PI, and what we are looking to ask them is this truly their core competency? How rigorous they have been in the science, how honest they have been with their own science, how have they done the tough experiments to really put their technology to test. And second is, are they aware of their limitations? Are they aware of their strengths? And how do they kind of manage those? Like, for example, I'm working with one academic from WashU who is very clear that, look, biology is my strength. I don't know how does a startup work. And so the moment that happens, he's like, look, as a VC, you have seen more companies come up. Tell me what you want to see, and then I can see if it works for me or not. And that level of honesty, I find it very attractive, because then I'm seeing a collaborativeness. I'm seeing an understanding that both of us have different skill sets, and being together will add value to the company. Again, and this goes back to the personality fit. Are you easy to work with? And again, look, there will always be a negotiation, but it doesn't have to be a fight. It can be a true negotiation, and has to be the right foundation for the long-term relationship. So again, we have talked about this a lot. Team is the big factor for our investment selection, and that always is the case. One thing that you may not have heard from a lot of VCs is the investment memo. This is an internal document that we never share outside. And this is a document that really captures our thoughts in the most crude way. This is a document that our LPs who give us money can review before they invest in us, saying that, how do you think about investments? How many and this is, a document they may ask, how do you go back and evaluate if you made the right decision? And these documents really help us form our thesis around it, and kind of put our thought on the paper, so that one, go back and learn from it, and second, really help us organize the thinking, present it to our IC investment committee, who may be hearing the story for the first or the second time, and really forms the, kind of the center around which we discuss things. Again, I'll kind of skip this given the time constraint. Now, crossing the finish line. Obviously, we have told you guys a lot about that. This is a long process. It could be a strenuous process. But how long does it take? And honestly, I have seen investment deals being done in a month from the first discussion, and I have seen it last for a year. So I think this is not going to be a standard answer. I think you're looking for signs of progress as you go through it. And the signs mean, are more and more senior people of the fund getting engaged in a more meaningful way? Are they starting to talk to you beyond science? Are they talking about, okay, what kind of a CSO do you think would be ideal for the company? Are they thinking about what this company would look like, right? Are they engaging external experts to review your material? Are they paying external consultants to give them a report on this? So then obviously comes the term sheet that, these are the terms on which we'll invest. And after that comes the detailed documents that, that the lawyers make a lot of money on, but is actually the most critical piece to make sure that the expectations are set correct. And then finally is, we always say this, you don't have the money till it is wired and it's in the company's bank, because things can go wrong in the last minute. And we've seen enough where things at the last piece of final documentation have been an issue. I've seen people where I found some corporate structure that had some legal liability, and people have walked away from it. And so it's not done till it is done is really true in this case. So I think that kind of covers everything that I wanted. And we have our contact information on the slide. So if anybody wants to reach out. And I have to say that I'm proud that I wanted to leave 5 minutes at the end, and I am at 1:25. So, Mike, if there are any questions, you or otherwise, please fire away.
Yeah, so well done on the timing. I've seen this presentation. You guys are great, and it was a lot of great information, so thank you for doing that. I actually do have a couple more questions since we have a few more minutes. So can you talk, and since Osage especially focuses on companies that are formed in an academic setting, so someone wanted to hear some succinct thoughts on the pros and cons of forming a startup in an academic setting.
Yeah, I mean, almost everything that we invest in has been a startup in the academic setting. Now, sometimes a VC has gone in talking to a PI and has created the entity by licensing the technology from the tech transfer office, engaging with the PI. Sometimes the PI has formed an entity, and then the investors have come in and invested in that entity. I don't think there are many pros and cons. The only thing that I've seen being a big hurdle is somebody forms an entity. Sometimes what happens is some actions that have been taken on the cap table, they cannot be undone. And the way the common stock and the founder stock has been issued cannot be undone. And so that becomes a problem in the legal operations on how to get the money in. There is always a way around it, but it just adds an extra hurdle sometimes. So if you have to form a legal entity, as we discussed earlier, for SBIR, STTR, the goal along with that should be is to keep the cap table in the simplest way. Work with the attorneys who work with VCs all the time, so that you make sure that there is provisions to make change. There is provision which are aligned with what VCs would ideally look for, so that you don't create that friction when they have got over all the hurdles, and now the legal structure is what is causing an issue.
Great. And I'm going to ask this question, which will probably push us just a little over time, but I think it's spot on for you. Someone wanted advice as PhD scientists who are looking for opportunities in venture capital themselves, as you have ended up. So, can you talk about that very briefly?
Yeah. I think today's world, I think it's the easiest time in the life science to get into VCs, because a lot of VCs are raising a lot of capital and therefore getting bigger and bigger in the team. Having said that, it's still a very, very, very small fraction of the employment opportunity. I will never advise anybody to go full throttle on only one goal to get into VC, just because these are so opportunistic. And as I said, like our fund has not hired since I have joined. Actually, we have made one hire since I have joined in the investment team, and I've been there for 4 years. So now you combine that, let's say that 20 funds, now there are only 20 positions in 4 years. That is a very opportunistic thing. And for somebody like, I even didn't do that. I came out of consulting saying, I have 3 different things I wanted to do. Either I do into a corporate DD role, I'm going to go into a VC role, or I'm going to go into a corporate strategy role at a big pharma. And I kind of lay that net and prioritize that. If I find VC, I really like it. And I was fortunate enough to find it. So that's the only thing. I think when you are going, let's say you do find that opportunity, I think the thing that they're looking for, more than the business side, they're really looking for the deep scientific expertise. Is how well are you read in the literature? Do you understand who are the biggest PIs in different fields? And that becomes the key. And then underneath it, you need to know what the basic drug development is. you need to understand some basics of the industry. Is like, for example, and again, sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. I did not know why is LNP is such the dark horse of the life science world. When I got into the VC world, I understood all the efforts that have been put in. So what I would say is, if you're interviewing for a VC, look at their portfolio and see what they're doing and try to understand what was learned from their failed investments. What is attractive about good investments? Because they will ask you, what kind of investment would you like to make? And honestly, it's a way for them to say, have you learned about us, to make sure what you suggest is in line with what they want to do. So, kind of, again, getting educated about them is going to be critical. But there is no silver bullet that I can say, like, if you do this, you can get a VC role. It's just a super opportunistic place.
Great. Well, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Anurag, for the presentation. And please pass our thanks on to Manny. To our audience, thank you for joining us. Reminder, the session has been recorded, and you will be receiving a link, and we'll share the deck as well, since Osage has been gracious enough to allow us to do that. We have 2 additional sessions later today, and registration is still open. So please check that out. The first is at 3 o'clock and is a nice follow-up to this conversation. It's called Startup Fundraising 101 from an angel investor perspective, and it's presented by Serena Glover, who is a very active angel investor in the Seattle, Washington area, a former entrepreneur, and one of Tech Transfer's National Advisory Board members. And then following that at 6 o'clock tonight, given her location on the West Coast, she's actually going to talk about how to become an angel investor. So if you think that's an interesting topic, please join us. Thank you all for joining us. Be well and go blue.